Here's a Mox. That's a Spirit Guide. That's a Grape Shot for 2,000.
Cool!
Yes. This is really fun and interactive.
Yeah.
David Danowitz.
Delightful.
Hey, yeah. Hey, up a game.
Honestly, when I first started playing Magic, equipment always kind of confused me. Like, when am I allowed to cast equipment? When can it be equipped to a creature? And these are all basic questions any beginner in Magic might ask, and hopefully I have your answers. So if there's a certain section you want to skip to, just check the timestamps down below. And, you know, while you're down there, if you want to tap that subscribe button, that'd be pretty cool too. Now, in the vast multiverse of Magic, there's 6 different classifications of cards: lands, enchantments, artifacts, creatures, instants, and sorceries. But we want to focus our attention here on artifacts, because all equipment cards in the game are subtypes of artifact cards. And this is important to know for later because it dictates when you can actually cast equipment onto the battlefield. But first, let's go over the basic components of what an equipment card is. Starting at the top left, we have the card name. At the top right, we have the mana cost. This is the amount of mana you have to pay in order to cast this card from your hand onto the battlefield. Moving to the center left side, we have the card type and subtype. On the center right side, we have the card set and rarity identifier. On the bottom of the card, we have the text box with the card's ability and description. And lastly, the equip cost. This is the amount of mana you have to pay in order to attach this card to a creature once it's on the battlefield. I also want to point out that not every equipment card will have this handy ability description printed in the text box. It will vary from card to card, even the same card from different sets may or may not include it. So if you're ever confused on what a certain ability does or how different cards interact with each other, a good rule of thumb is to just search it on Wizards of the Coast website for official rulings. 99% of the time though, there's already a Reddit post asking the same question with answers from people who know more about Magic than, I don't know, Jesse Pinkman knows about chemistry.
Liar. Copper.
And I know what you're thinking, okay cool, so we know the layout of equipment cards, but what do they do? Well, that's a very broad question because there's over 250 different equipment cards in Magic the Gathering. But I guess in its simplest form, equipment can either increase a creature's power and toughness, or give extra abilities those creatures wouldn't normally have, such as haste, flying, lifelink, and death touch just as a few examples. Equipment can also completely change the dynamic of how you play a game with the equipped creature by letting you copy their abilities, create tokens, cast free spells, and even one-shot other players. Plus, if you have the mana and cards, you can stack as many equipment as you want to a single creature with no limit. So the possible combinations of creatures and abilities are almost endless. Now that we know what equipment is, let's go over the how and when to use equipment. And since you're watching this beginner video, I'm just going to assume you're not entirely sure how the basic turn structure of Magic works, so I'm going to lay it out right here. Equipment cards can only be cast from your hand during your pre- or post-combat main phases. And to put equipment into play, you have to pay the mana cost of the card in the top right corner. And once it's on the battlefield, it's in play but has no effect on any creatures. It's not until you pay the equip cost and attach it to a creature that the equipment will then take effect. And the act of equipping a creature can also only be done at sorcery speeds. So you can only pay the equip cost to attach it to a creature in your pre- or post-combat main phases. Which means, even if you have equipment in play, unattached from a creature, and you end your turn, you cannot pay the equip cost to attach it to a creature until your next turn during your pre- or post-combat main phases. But in rare cases, there are exceptions to this rule with equipment cards that have flash or other permanents that give similar effects. And if you're not sure what flash is, it works the same way as instant spells, where they can be cast at any point during your turn ignoring the sorcery speed rule. This also includes being able to cast during your opponent's turn as long as you have the mana to pay for it, obviously. But this still does not affect the equip cost. Why, you ask? Because flash and other similar cards only affect the cards being casted from your hand, Equip is not a casted ability, it's an activated ability. So even if the equipment has flash and you cast it during your opponent's turn, you cannot pay to equip it to a creature until your next turn during your pre or post combat main phases, unless the card states otherwise. So just read carefully before paying that mana. Okay, but what if you have equipment that's attached to one creature and you want to switch it to another creature you control? What do? Well, this can be easily done by simply paying the equip cost again to reattach it to the other creature. But remember, this can only be done during your pre or post combat main phases, unless you have cards in play that say otherwise. Okay, but what if you have equipment that's attached to a creature and that creature dies or gets destroyed? What happens to the equipment? So if the equipped creature gets removed from the battlefield, the equipment simply becomes unattached and remains in play, and can be attached to another creature you control by paying the equip cost again. Really, the only time you have to worry about equipment being removed from the battlefield is if an opponent casts a destroy, exile, or board wipe spell. But before we move on, there's one more subject we need to tackle, and that's equipment with mana activated abilities, such as Shadow Spear and Sunforger. You see, Shadow Spear has a mana activated ability where if you pay 1 mana, permanents your opponent's control lose hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This ability can be activated at any time, and Shadow Spear does not have to be attached to a creature in order to use this ability. Sunforger also has a mana activated ability where if you pay 2 mana, you unattach Sunforger and search your library for a red or white instant card with converted mana cost 4 or less, and you can cast that card without paying its mana cost. And the difference between these two cards is that Sunforger has to be attached to a creature in order to use its ability, where Shadow Spear does not, simply because of the way the text is written. Now, this might seem fairly obvious to you, but it is a small detail that can be easily overlooked, so just read carefully. Basically, my whole point of this section is to just do your research beforehand and read carefully before spending that mana. On February 18th, 2022, Magic players were introduced to a new mechanic with the release of the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set, Reconfigure, and the Artifact Creature Equipment cards. And at first glance, you would assume that Reconfigure is the same thing as Equip, right? I mean, they both have a mana cost to attach to a target creature, they both enhance the creature they're attaching to, and they can only be cast at sorcery speeds. So what's the difference? Well, for one, cards with Reconfigure are creatures first and equipment second. And to better explain what I mean by this, let's examine the reality chip. When you cast this card, it enters the battlefield as a 0/4 artifact creature that is subject to the same basic creature summoning rules as normal creatures. It has summoning sickness, it can attack, and it can block, and has the ability you may look at the top card of your library at any time. It's not until you pay the Reconfigure cost that it stops being a creature and turns into equipment that gets attached to another creature you control, which will then unlock this card's secondary ability of being able to play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. And since Reconfigure cards are both equipment and creatures, if it's attached to another creature you control and you use that creature to attack in your combat phase, you can pay the Reconfigure cost in your post-combat main phase to unattach it and put up an extra blocker, since Reconfigure cards do not tap with the creatures they're attached to. Another key difference between Equip and Reconfigure is the way they interact with other cards that reduce the equip cost of equipment spells. For example, cards like Steel Shaper and Leonin Shikari will effect a normal equipment card like Grafted Exoskeleton, but will not effect a Reconfigure card like Blade of the Oni, because they reduce or alternate specifically the equip ability, not Reconfigure. However, cards like Pure Steel Paladin will effect both Equip and Reconfigure because it targets all cards in the equipment subtype, and gives them a new universal ability, which allows you to equip Blade of the Oni for 0 mana. But in order to unattach it, you still have to pay the mana for the Reconfigure cost. It's an odd interaction between cards and can get really confusing, so when in doubt, just look up the official rulings online. Lastly, cards such as Sigarda's Aid and Brass Squire will also work with both Equip and Reconfigure because they reference the keyword attach, which is described on both types of cards, and is not specific to Equip or Reconfigure. If Michael Bay has taught us anything, it's that people love explosions, fast-speed highway chase scenes that defy the laws of physics, and things that transform. With that said, at some point during your journey through the Magic universe, you will find in your collection transforming cards. And I'm just going to cover this briefly, but if you have equipment attached to a creature that transforms into another creature, then that equipment stays attached. But if you have equipment that's attached to a creature and it transforms into a permanent that's not a creature, like Soul Seizure or other creatures that transform into planeswalkers, then the equipment will fall off and remain in play, and can be equipped to another creature you control by paying the equip cost again. But that's pretty much it for this video. I tried to cover every aspect of equipment cards that I could think of, and try to help you get a better understanding of how some of the mechanics in Magic work. Now, I'm not a professional by any means or employed by Wizards of the Coast, so if there's anyone who would disagree with the statements I made, please let me know in the comments down below, so we can correct it to better help future players. Thanks for watching, and remember,
don't let your dreams be dreams.